Moving? Yes, thank you.
I'd like to address a question to the first presenter. I have been reading myself on prioritization, and I would like to perhaps you could explain to me the difference between Marxist term and how Stiegler is using it. Because Marx never, it appears that Marx never intended to use the proletariat to characterize only the working class. And what is Stiegler bringing onto the table in terms of this conversation? Does he only refer to our times, to the changes that obviously Marx couldn't have foreseen, or is he actually intervening within this concept?
I don't know if I will be able to answer very precisely, but maybe just general ideas that I have on this point. I think Stiegler insists on the fact that Marx, in the Le Manifeste du Parti Communiste, Marx says at a certain point that proletariat will concern all the population. And Stiegler insists on this point because I think it is important for him to say that the question of proletarianization does not only concern know-hows of workers in factories, but also different type of knowledge. For example, what he calls know how to live, or theoretical knowledge, and this externalization of this kind of knowledge, they happened after Marx. So Marx was not able to describe them. So I think Stiegler he prefers to speak about proletarianization because it is like a process, and at each technical epoch this process can take new form, whereas the notion of proletariat, even if Marx said that it could concern everybody, at the beginning it was associated with a class, so like a quite a substantial group, and but I think there is no opposition between the two, but just an extension of what happened for the manual know-hows to other type of knowledge. I think this is the interest of the notion of proletarianization. Does it answer?
Question kind of builds on that question, and then builds to a question really, which I think anyone on the panel can address. It's not really just anyone. I think the importance of the difference between Marx and Stiegler on proletarianization, but for Marx, proletarianization is precisely a political economic category, as we kind of said yesterday, about exploitation rather than alienation. And for Stiegler, it's an anthropological category, I would say, and this is how I'm pushing towards the question, about the inherent tendency within human existence to be alienated in some form. And this isn't kind of like necessarily a bad thing, right? It's an anthropological category for Stiegler rather than something which has gone wrong because of techniques. It's just a factor of that relationship. I think maybe that's important to note, the difference between exploitation and alienation. Stiegler, for me, isn't really concerned with exploitation in the same way that Marx is, I think. But that's a different question. So my question is about precisely this anthropological element, because in your presentation, Anne, you really gave a kind of anthropological reading of Stiegler, I think, in some sense. And in your presentation also, Anne, you seem to emphasize an anthropological bent in Stiegler by sort of connecting closer to L'Obohan rather than Simondon, and this kind of bodily element. And then we had a kind of exploration of the disjunction, I think, in some ways, between an anthropological mode of thinking and something which tries to imitate it in some senses. And what I'm kind of interested in is whether, for all three of you, Simondon can be considered an anthropological thinker. Even though he tries to move away from a kind of anthropocentrism, I still think there is a concern for me anyway, anthropology, just how all three of you would kind of take that kind of interpretation.
Okay.
Who would like to kick off on that one?
I can start, but
Yeah.
so just on the I come back on what you said about proletarianization, and then I answer on the question of anthropology. So yes, I think what you said is very important, because if you take, for example, because I don't have a point of view on Marx precisely, because I haven't studied the thing in this question, so I cannot answer. But for example, if you take what the problem of for Simondon, the problem of Marx is that for him alienation is is only a question of exploitation. It's only a question of who own the means of production. And Simondon says no, it's not sufficient. It's not only an economic question. It's a psychological and physiological question. It is what is written in the book. And he said because the problem is the relation between the even if he possesses the device, he doesn't know the device, so he cannot have a good a relation like a yes. So he cannot interpret it. He cannot. So this is alienation for Simondon, and I think that Stigler. I mean, he how do you say that? Il s'appuie sur cette analyse de Simondon. He lean on this analysis of Simondon to say that alienation is not only a question of who possess the means of production, but a question of can you understand or not. Can you understand what the human activity which is crystallized inside, and can you understand the knowledge that has been? Are you able to re-internalize the knowledge that has been externalized? And this is a non-anthropological question, or this is the question which puts anthropology into question, because it is the fact is that as soon as there is human beings, or as soon as there is a living being which is able to externalize technically, then he will lose a part of his knowledge. I mean, he is never achieved, he is never complete, because as soon as he's technical, he's externalizing some knowledge. So you see what I mean? So this is more the question of proletarianization is at the origin, at the beginning of humanization, and this is why we cannot speak of humanization anymore, because it's and just on the question on Simondon and anthropology, I don't have an answer, but I have a question. If there is something for me which is really strange, is the fact that in the thesis of individuation, in the big thesis, Simondon criticizes really strongly the anthropological perspective. He says you cannot do anthropology. As soon as you are speaking about anthropology, you are supposing that there is a human nature and a human essence, and this is not the case, because we cannot speak of human essence. We have to speak of psychic and collective process of individuation. And at the same time, so he is really clear on that, and at the same time, on the mode of existence of technical objects, he is speaking about human reality everywhere, and this is quite disturbing, because he has just shown before that we shouldn't, and he's also speaking about alienation, which supposes that there is a nature, because if there is an alienation, there is a nature. So I don't have an answer on that, but I think there is a tension in his. Okay, so.
Okay, should we move down the panel?
What do you call anthropology? I mean, you have to define the thing first, right? If you take it as being an evolutionary line of historicity for mankind, I mean, obviously, who can believe it nowadays, right? So you have to move from anthropology to something which is rather different, and which is a history of process of harmonization, right? And so it doesn't mean that we have to move from biology. I believe we have to integrate biology and technology, and I believe that this is exactly what digital technology is about to achieve. And it doesn't mean that technicity is something that you can explain without taking in consideration the historical multiple developments of humanities. So, and you shouldn't remain on the level of anthropology, or you should take anthropology as being a compared metaphysics of pluriversity, right? As I'm thinking about contemporary anthropology, for instance, in Brazil, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, for instance, and other thinkers who are very much intrigued by the way that Western conscience, that Western metaphysics wrote the history of mankind. And so Simondon is a cat in this history, because he doesn't want anymore to understand the technical evolution of society as being something that happens to one human body that would have been individuated previously. And therefore it is impossible to oppose, as you did, culture and technicity. Because if we do so, the only way that we have to escape our current situation is to believe that we do exist besides this technological mode of subjectivation. But I ask you, could you see without your glasses? Your brains are already externalized. And so we have to move on from this situation and understand the relationship between biology and technicity in order, with a battery of new concepts such as information or disparation or modulation, in order to understand our current situation. But if we do so in the terms of the ancient metaphysics, it's impossible to achieve.
Well, okay, very quickly. I find it not very fitting to look at Simondon and think it's anthropology or what's happening, because I think it's very much a thinker that takes you out of any discipline and out of any boundaries, and really is as multifaceted as Anne also said. Sometimes I find it more, it's, of course he lives in the 60s, existentialism being quite a big thing, obviously, in France. So I have the feeling that there is a sort of kind love-hate relationship there very much. The externalization then makes me always cringe, because it's very hard to think an externalization without an original something, and what is that, So there I'm really very much with Anne. Also, we were moaning so much that the first thing we do nowadays is look on your phones, but most of us actually put on their glasses before they look on their phones, but no one moans about that, So it's also, I'm not so sure about also do we need to understand it? How deep do we understand it? Do we want to, go back to a society which has no diversion of labor? That's the question that is for me there in the background, and for me personally, politically, it's no. I like diversion of labor very much, because it frees me up to do other things. But that doesn't mean that there needs to be a mode of control or a mode of. You could also rethink externalization as something very different. For example, the human race is born out of externalization, and giving birth is externalization. And so you could actually, that was just...
Yeah. Can I just add something on externalization? Because the concept itself comes from Leroy-Gourand. It's really interesting. And it came also from kind of a Hegelian perspective, where technicity is understood as a, let's say, a liberation process, where the capacity to transform the outer reality into spiritual subjectivity. But Leroy-Gourhan is much more interesting than Hegel, because Leroy-Gourhan says he says that the construction of the body, the construction of the body, the foot and the spine and then the skull, is the transcendental condition of possibility of the brain. And so that it means that in the multiple process of harmonization, right, not only Homo sapiens, but a bunch of harmonization, there has been a material moment of possibility for the brain to expand, so that you cannot take the brain as being something that is trying to externalize itself, because the brain has been produced by a material transformation of the body. And so it means that the brain has been historically constructed, and this is quite amusing to note.
Taking to the comment, actually also taking to the pluralization, that was really a question I wanted to ask, and then thank you for the question, really. Because I was wondering, what proletariat bourgeoisie, in technology, field of technology. So hackers are bourgeoisie? I don't think so. Kind of like there's a famous acronym, FOMO, like fear of missing out. That happening to me. For the Facebook, there are a bunch of surge of information. I'm in the morning, I'm already checking what information are coming out, and then it's kind of every day is the same thing is happening. So I feel myself enslaved to the information, especially technology. So what I'm thinking is that maybe everybody in the world, whether a person has a technical, skills to adapt himself to the technology world, everybody become enslaved to the technology, I guess. You can.
I'm not.
Maybe the influence, and also yesterday I asked Anne Alombert, actually.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Pronounce it,
What or who endows a social agency to human being? Actually, I asked them. I got some hint of the idea, from your previous view, presentation of previous view. Because from the flow of Facebook, actually, the Mercedes kindly explained the process of the development of the technology. On Facebook, invisible flow, I can feel. What I mean is maybe the who's that? The guy. Who's the founder of the
Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg, and then his team made some kind of algorithm, whatever, to identify some kind of something. But what I mean is there's something invisible, apart from something human being invented. Something is moving on, and then we are influenced by that something invisible, intangible. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, but that argument's a very old argument. If you go back to Plato, you can actually find him moaning about writing, and he says, oh, the written word is so bad, and the young people are also dumb because they don't make their own experiences. They believe what other people have experienced and just read what other people have written. So that's a classic argument that sort of comes with technology over the centuries in the Western culture. And I'm not sure.
But the interesting thing is
I hope it ends at some point.
How do we know that Plato was against writing? So this is the main point. How do we know that Socrates was against writing? It is because young Plato, was after Socrates and said, "Oh, I'm going to write down that it's impossible to write." So the idea is that philosophy is related to an externalized brain since the beginning, and you have to take this in consideration with something else, which I did not refer to today, but which is very important. It is language as being technology. And so there are different steps of technological language, and speech, and then writing, but then the pre-industrial cut of print in the late 15th century is something that we cannot understand if we don't take this in consideration with this other cut that we have endured and that we don't know how to deal with right now, and this is the digital cut. But then in order to understand these steps, you need a philosophy of history that is not a Hegelian one, right? And so this is quite a difficulty, but it is also very much interesting. Therefore, the method of comparison, because we cannot go into industrial or digital analysis without being on the edge. And this is our situation. It is exactly the same situation that Socrates and Plato had, because they say in the middle of oral and writing cultures, they said, no, writing is bad, because they were capable to make the cuts and the comparison. And so it is not possible to face the problem of digital in itself. What is possible, and this is exactly what we're doing, because we were schooled in the old mentality of industry. Therefore, phenomenology remains in the level of industrialization. It is impossible to face on the level of consciousness, on individual consciousness, the type of modulation, algorithmic modulation that we are combined with today.
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions. Are you sure?
I had a question for you.
Okay, well, maybe take Ian's question, and then we'll give maybe a last chance for you to kind of.
It's more a remark on the responses to Ben's question. I was so sort of full of admiration for all three papers, I didn't think I'd have any questions. But something you said, Mercedes, about the sort of existential background that's hinted in there, and what you said, Anne, about Simondon's use of the term human reality. Because obviously in the post-war period, the réalité humaine is the traditional sort of Jean Beaufret-inspired translation of Dasein.
Yeah, I know.
And of course, Dasein is very much detached by Heidegger from any anthropological conception, so there might not be so much of a contradiction there. And it brings me back to sort of Stiegler, because what's interesting to me about Stiegler is that going through Leroi-Gourhan, but conjugating Leroi-Gourhan with Heidegger, and later sort of Husserl and then more Husserl, he's sort of passing through that phenomenological moment, but inspired by Derrida in a very deconstructive fashion. So when he comes to think exteriorization and Leroi-Gourhan, it's trying to sort of, if you like, via a Derrida reading of Heidegger, it's trying to extract that anthropological moment from Leroi-Gourhan.
Yeah.
And that means that exteriorization, and one might not want to buy into it or not, is in a sense an always-already exteriorization that doesn't presuppose any prior plenitude or phenomenological body proper, and the advent of the human is a co-constitution with techniques without techniques
Right, but
supervening
then
on it.
it's not relevant, because the idea is, where do you begin? Do you begin on the level of organology or not?
Sure.
So this is the point.
Indeed,
I
suppose-
agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And my sense then is that actually, if one considers it in that way, it brings Stiegler much more closer to you than perhaps was implied. Because I can see the difference that's trying to be brought out, but if one sees him going through this sort of post-phenomenological deconstructive path through into this, rather than say, Spinoza, Bergson, and then after Simondon, Deleuze, then there's a difference of emphasis there, but actually it's much more closer to what you're saying, because there's still a processual thing there. So I'm wondering whether that's a sort of a way of bringing him a bit more closer to you. In
Conciliation is not always interesting,
No, I just wanted to say that what you said with the problem of the notion of externalization is exactly what Stiegler said in the Techniques and Time. It's saying we cannot speak about, I was speaking about externalization because it's easier to explain, but he says we cannot speak about externalization because there is no origin before, and because what we usually call interiority is constituted by the process of externalization. So this is a processual way of thinking with what the interesting point is the relation between interiority and
exteriority.
But I have one problem there, and that's that there seems to be a conflation between, in Stiegler's critique of capitalism, between technology and capitalism, and I find this highly problematic.
I don't know. Maybe this impression is due to the fact that in fact, technology has become a very efficient mean for contemporary capitalism. So maybe maybe sometimes a critic of capitalism is also a critic of the way it is using technology. But I think the pharmacological position is the contrary of that, because you have to, the technology cannot be a bouc émissaire, cannot be a pharmakos, cannot be a...
Yeah, I like the notion of pharmakon, but if I look at the examples that are then actually discussed, it's most of the time it's, negative examples of technology. And that shifts the whole thing. And I think it's quite important because I have the feeling, there's an ideology in which we all live in the 21st century, which does exactly that, conflating technology and capitalism. You can read it every day in the paper. We hate our technology, that we have to work on the weekends and answer emails is of course not capitalism or a boss that remains an answer, but it's this. And that's just, and that's for me highly problematic. And it also pushes technology into a situation that everybody all anti-capitalists are anti-technology, leaving the development of technology to capitalism. And that's the world we live in, and that really frightens me quite a bit.
That's why pharmacology is I think it's a good way to escape this alternative of technophobia or techno, I don't know to say in English, the philia. Yeah, so it's...
Just really quickly come in on that.
Please do, Robert.
Interesting thing that's been said, and it's around the sort of banal cultural reproduction of technology in everyday life. So you picked up on sort of journalistic tropes in relation to technology, and I think that's really where the game is being played. When people kind of moan about popular cultural representations around technology, they tend to think of Black Panther and Afrofuturism or something, but actually, it's a great film. You haven't watched it.
Yeah.
But actually, it's this kind of banal reproduction of the concept of technology that I find really quite interesting, and I think that's where the debate kind of can be had, as opposed to Hollywood being this kind of monster that perpetuates Terminators and so on. Yeah, so what?
Does that chime with you, Mercedes? And does that sense of where an element of a certain kind of political struggle might be at the level of the popular?
Yeah, I go a bit back that I really find we are sort of living quite blind, because I have the feeling we are really buying too quickly into the fact that technology is the same as capitalism, and we miss out a lot of chances to make it our technology. Instead, we just negate it, and by negating it, we change nothing. And that's the difference between a cultural critique and a technological critique. And we need to understand that these cannot, we try a technological critique with a gesture of a cultural critique, but it doesn't work. And that's quite...
We've got things lining up, and I'm slightly away of the time, but I've got Yuk and then possibly Cecile, so I think that might have to do us for the moment. So Yuk first.
Yes, just to be quick, I think that Steve never has made a difference between technology and capitalism. If one says that, it's just because one didn't read Steve. And we have to also pay attention to what is, well, 2 points. One is concerning Plato. When Plato says about writing, he didn't say that it is bad. Yeah. He says that writing, well, because the conversation.
Oh, I never said that. I know that.
Yeah. No, that's also to introduce the question of the pharmacon. Writing will be able to help us to remember. So it's positive on that side. But because it helps us to remember, it also helps us to forget, because we don't have to remember. So there is that role that is not reducible to each other, and that is the question of technology, that it cannot be reduced to good or it cannot be reduced to bad. It is always at the same time good and bad, and that is the Davidian idea. So the question is not that the identical technology with capitalism, but rather to see the good and the bad within technology, and in what way should we fight against this tendency of becoming poison of the technological development, and that is how discourse around alternatives to capitalism or alternative technology and so on and so forth. So that's what one point. The second point is regarding the tension between ontology and politics. Because I feel like that it is true that, especially in Anne's the second
Sauvagnargues.
talk about moderation and so on, and it is true. I think that if we want to explain individuation, we should not start with something which is already individuated. That is the critique of Simondon, and that is the ontological critique. Now the problem is here. The problem is that if I want to explain this computer, if we start from the very beginning, then we are not going to. We won't have time to explain the whole integration of this computer. It must start from somewhere. And this is the question of an interpretation of what Simondon called pre-individual. So Simondon remains ontological critique when he says that we can call the pre-individual nature. And there is another interpretation of the pre-individual for people like Stigler or people associated with Etienne Balibar, who worked on the individual. We just try to see the question if we can find a pre-individual, which does not only include nature, but also history and technology.
Of course.
Now, from this perspective, we enter from the ontological critique to a political critique, if I can say so.
Can I respond quickly? So, 3 remarks. The first would be the question is not is Plato or Socrates say writing is bad, is not bad. The question is that the status of mediation appears in philosophy, in the beginning of philosophy, as being a question of how can philosophy even exist. So this was my point, was to point out something that I would call a philotechnosophy in itself, and so meaning that there is no possibility for philosophers to ask if technique would be convenient or not, because they have been technicized. This is my point, okay? I'm not taking a moralist consideration, right? The second thing is this idea of externalization. I do agree that Bernard is much careful about this, but my point remains. Why organology? Why not mechanology? Organology is on the level of the elements, while mechanology is on the level of the set. And so this is my question.
I don't know, but there is a thing that I wanted to say about organology is that in Stigler's vocabulary, it's not the same thing in Canguilhem and Simondon and Stigler. And
of course.
In Stigler, it is the theory of the relations between somatic organism, artificial organs, and social organization. So there are 3 types of organization: biological, technical, artificial, and social. And so, and we cannot say that one of them was the beginning. No, they were all at the if there is one of them, there is the 2 other. And what is interesting is the relations and the processes between these 3. And there is 2 possibilities. I mean, it's a very schematic way to say that, but either they are going to destruct each other, either they are going to be negantropic, to be like. So I think it is quite close to what you said about ecology and Guattari, but I don't know Guattari very well on that, so I don't know. But I think it is a quite close perspective. But
if you want, I mean, I don't want. Why not? I mean,
I don't know. I
would say, of course, Bernard Stiegler is well aware of the, let's say, a body without organ conception of organology. But then my question remains: why on the level of organology?
Sorry, I just have one quick comment.
Why don't you ask him?
The question is that
I did already.
We're not. Is not from Canguilhem. Organology is a term in music. The study of musical organs.
Yeah.
that's not Canguilhem's appropriation of their song, like the relation between imaging and machines. We started with general organology in 2003
Yeah.
in the book of the Mise symbolique, where he started, and because at the time he was director of year camp.
Yeah.
So that
Of
was
course.
about the subject of instrument.
Yeah.
So we have to make such a, and so from that perspective, it is possible to see that this organology of Stigler, which is different from the organology of Canguilhem,
Of course.
is actually very similar to Simondon's methodology.
Okay, thank
But
you.
then,
Okay,
my question remains.
one last. Are you sure? Are you sure? Okay, that's very kind of you, Cecile, because actually we are kind of running, and our Shika there has to just kind of nip out to kind of hold lunch.
Right.
Take it away from us.
Can I thank you very, very much for a fascinating panel.